Imagine spending your life savings on your dream home, only to have your neighborhood HOA president show up at your door demanding you repaint your entire house beige within 30 days, or face daily fines that could total tens of thousands of dollars, all because you chose a color that made you happy, and then discovering a legal loophole so brilliant that you not only avoid the fines but turn your home into the most spectacular statement of individual freedom your community has ever seen. Quick note before we begin. This is a fictional, dramatized story for education and entertainment. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental. This story is inspired by common HOA situations people talk about online. All names and details here are fictional. Marcus Chen had been dreaming of owning his own home since he was a kid growing up in a cramped apartment where he'd tape his artwork to every available wall surface. And at 34, after years of saving every possible dollar while working as a graphic designer, he finally closed on a beautiful 1920s Victorian home in Sunset Ridge Estates, a planned community about 40 minutes outside the city. The house needed work. The previous owners had let it deteriorate over the years, but Marcus saw potential in every creaky floorboard and cracked window pane, and he especially loved the ornate wooden trim and detailed gingerbread architecture that reminded him of the fairy tale books his grandmother used to read to him. He spent his first 3 months stripping old wallpaper, refinishing floors, updating the kitchen, and carefully restoring the home's original character. And when it came time to repaint the exterior, Marcus chose a warm, cheerful yellow with crisp white trim because it made him smile every time he pulled into the driveway and reminded him of sunshine and possibility. He checked the HOA guidelines carefully before painting. The covenant mentioned that homes should be painted in colors harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic, but provided no specific color restrictions or approval process. So Marcus hired a professional painting crew and spent nearly $8,000 transforming his home from dingy gray to vibrant yellow. For 2 glorious weeks, Marcus would come home from work, park his car, and just stand on his front lawn admiring the transformation, feeling genuine pride that this beautiful place was actually his. And his partner Daniel would joke that Marcus spent more time staring at the house than actually living in it. But on a Tuesday afternoon during his 3rd week in his newly painted home, Marcus answered his doorbell to find Patricia Hawthorne, the HOA president, standing on his porch with a clipboard, a severely pinched expression, and a formal letter that would change everything. Patricia didn't bother with pleasantries. She informed Marcus in clipped, condescending tones that his yellow house was entirely inappropriate for Sunset Ridge Estates, that yellow was far too bold and attention-seeking for their community standards, and that he had violated the aesthetic harmony clause of the HOA covenant. Marcus, confused and increasingly anxious, explained that he'd read the guidelines and found no specific restrictions on yellow, but Patricia cut him off with a dismissive wave, stating that the HOA board had the authority to interpret harmonious as they saw fit, and their interpretation was that acceptable colors included beige, tan, gray, white, and subtle earth tones only. The letter she handed Marcus was even more devastating than her words. It gave him exactly 30 days to repaint his entire house in an approved color, or face a fine of $500 per day until he complied, which could potentially cost him $15,000 per month if he didn't immediately submit to their demands. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he read the letter, calculating that between the fines and the cost of repainting, he could lose everything he'd worked for, but something in Patricia's smug, self-satisfied smile as she turned to leave sparked something in him that refused to simply accept this injustice. That evening, Marcus and Daniel sat at their kitchen table surrounded by HOA documents, covenant agreements, and architecture guidelines, reading every single word multiple times. And that's when Daniel noticed something interesting. The covenant specified harmonious colors, but never actually defined what that meant or listed approved colors anywhere in the official recorded documents. The only place specific colors were mentioned was in a supplemental guideline document that Patricia had attached to her letter, but this document had never been formally voted on by the HOA membership or recorded with the county as an official covenant amendment, which meant legally it was just a suggestion, not an enforceable rule. Marcus felt his designer brain start working in overdrive as an idea began forming. If the covenant only required harmonious colors without defining them, and if Patricia was claiming yellow was too bold, then he needed to understand what harmonious actually meant in a legal sense. He spent the next 3 days researching HOA law, property rights, and color theory, and he discovered that harmonious, in design terms, actually means colors that work well together and create visual balance, which could technically include any colors on the spectrum as long as they were balanced properly. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. If you're finding value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've ever experienced a similar HOA or neighborhood situation, feel free to share your story in the comments. Marcus also discovered something fascinating in the original 1985 HOA founding documents. The covenant stated that any home painted in a historically accurate style consistent with its architectural period was automatically exempt from color restrictions, a clause apparently designed to protect the community's historic Victorian and craftsman homes. His house was built in 1924, and after researching Victorian-era paint colors, Marcus learned that Victorians were actually famous for being painted in bold, vibrant, multicolor schemes called painted ladies. In fact, the most historically accurate way to paint his Victorian home would be with multiple bright colors highlighting its architectural details. Armed with this research, Marcus contacted Linda Park, a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, and when he showed her the documents and his research, she actually laughed and said this was one of the most ironclad cases she'd seen in years. Linda explained that not only was the supplemental color guideline likely unenforceable, but Marcus's historic exemption argument was legally brilliant, and she'd be happy to represent him if the HOA pushed forward with fines. Meanwhile, Patricia had begun her campaign of harassment in earnest. She sent Marcus 3 additional letters in 1 week, each more threatening than the last. She drove past his house twice daily taking photographs, and she began pressuring his neighbors to complain about his eyesore property, though most neighbors actually told Marcus privately that they loved the yellow and thought Patricia was being ridiculous. But here's where Marcus's plan went from defensive to absolutely legendary. Instead of just repainting his house yellow again, or fighting to keep the yellow, Marcus decided to exercise his historic exemption right and paint his Victorian home in the most spectacularly authentic painted lady color scheme possible, which meant using not 1 or 2 colors, but 7 different vibrant shades in a rainbow gradient that would highlight every single architectural detail of his ornate Victorian home. When Marcus told Linda his plan, she verified that Victorian polychrome schemes were indeed historically documented and that his approach was legally protected under the historic exemption clause. So Marcus hired a specialized historic paint consultant who designed a stunning rainbow gradient scheme, deep red on the base siding flowing through orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple across different sections, with white and gold accents on all the detailed trim work, creating a breathtaking spectrum effect that honored the home's 1924 heritage while making an unmistakable statement about individual freedom and creative expression. The transformation took 3 weeks and cost Marcus $12,000, more than his original yellow paint job, but the result was absolutely magnificent, and his Victorian home became an instant neighborhood landmark that people would drive from across town to photograph. Patricia's reaction was even better than Marcus had hoped. She showed up at his house the day after completion, literally shaking with rage, clipboard clutched so tightly her knuckles were white, and she screamed that he deliberately defied the HOA and that she'd fine him $1,000 per day for this abomination. Marcus, standing calmly on his rainbow-painted porch, simply handed her a folder containing the historic exemption clause, 3 legal opinions from Linda confirming his right to paint in period-appropriate colors, extensive historical documentation of Victorian-era painted lady homes, photographs of similar homes in historic districts across America, and a preemptive cease and desist letter warning the HOA against any retaliatory fines or harassment. Patricia's face went from red to purple as she read the documents, and without another word, she turned and stormed away. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. Patricia was the type who'd rather burn down the entire HOA than admit she was wrong. Sure enough, 3 days later, Marcus received notice that the HOA was calling an emergency special meeting to vote on a retroactive ban on rainbow or multicolor paint schemes, which would have required Marcus to repaint again. But Linda immediately filed an injunction arguing that retroactive rules specifically targeting one homeowner constituted discriminatory enforcement and selective prosecution under state HOA law. The judge agreed and issued a temporary restraining order blocking any new color rules until a full hearing could be held, and in the meantime, something unexpected started happening. Marcus's neighbors began speaking up. James Rivera, who lived 3 doors down, showed up at the next regular HOA meeting and delivered an impassioned speech about how Patricia had created a hostile, controlling environment that made everyone afraid to personalize their own homes, and how Marcus's beautiful Victorian home had actually increased property values because it was now a recognized local landmark. Other homeowners chimed in with their own stories of Patricia's overreach. Someone had been fined for planting roses in their front yard, another for installing a decorative mailbox, another for having a wreath on their door during the wrong season. And suddenly the meeting became less about Marcus's house and more about Patricia's pattern of tyrannical behavior. Within 2 months, a group of fed-up homeowners organized a petition to recall Patricia from the HOA board, gathered the required signatures, and forced a special election where she was removed from her position by a vote of 73 to 12. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Margaret Wells, immediately moved to rescind all of Patricia's arbitrary fines and to rewrite the HOA guidelines with clear, specific, enforceable rules that respected homeowner rights while maintaining reasonable community standards, and she personally apologized to Marcus for the harassment he'd endured. The final hearing on Linda's injunction became unnecessary when the new HOA board voted to officially recognize Marcus's historic exemption and to create a new provision protecting historically accurate restorations, and they even featured his home in the community newsletter as an example of preserving architectural heritage. Marcus's Rainbow Victorian became something of a local celebrity. A food blogger used it as a backdrop for photos and tagged Marcus, who gained thousands of social media followers. A local news station did a feature story about HOA overreach and homeowner rights, and the community's property values actually increased by an average of 4% over the next year, partly because Sunset Ridge Estates became known as that neighborhood with the amazing rainbow house. As for Patricia, she moved out of Sunset Ridge Estates 6 months after losing her board position, reportedly unable to handle the daily reminder of her defeat every time she drove past Marcus's spectacular Rainbow Victorian, and neighbors reported that she never once looked in its direction during those final months. Marcus still lives in his rainbow house today, and he's added even more colorful touches over the years. A garden with flowers in every color imaginable, a hand-painted rainbow mailbox, and decorative shutters with intricate designs. And he's become an advocate for homeowner rights, even starting a website that helps people understand their HOA covenants and fight back against overreach. The story spread beyond his community, inspiring other homeowners facing similar battles to research their own HOA documents, find their own loopholes, and stand up for their right to make their homes reflect their personalities. And Marcus received messages from people across the country thanking him for proving that sometimes the best way to fight an unjust rule isn't to simply comply or quietly resist, but to find a creative solution that's so perfectly legal and so beautifully executed that it transforms opposition into celebration. If Marcus Chen's battle to turn HOA tyranny into a stunning celebration of individual expression and historic preservation taught you something about knowing your rights and standing up for creative freedom, please hit that like button right now. Every like helps us reach more homeowners who need to hear these stories about fighting back against unjust restrictions. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we share new HOA and property rights stories every week that could save you from similar overreach and harassment. This story shows why understanding your legal documents and thinking creatively about solutions matters more than simply accepting what someone in authority tells you, and your support through likes and subscriptions helps us continue bringing you these real-world lessons about standing your ground. Take just 2 seconds to like and subscribe before you go. We appreciate every single one of you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.